start, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's discussion, which sort of furthers the events surrounding the exhibitions of Dan Graham's work, both here and with our collaborators, Camden Art Centre. And I'm happy myself, well, almost happy, to cede my revered slot at 5 o'clock to lecture, which so I won't be giving my lecture now, although I shall start again with renewed venom next Friday at 5. The organisation of the evening that we propose is that for the first hour, our three invited speakers should make a short sort of 20-minute presentation. Our guests are Michael Newman, who is head of the Slade Theoretical, Philosophical and Theoretical Relation to Art. It's too much philosophy. And Chrissie Iles from MoMA in London, and Judith Goddard, the artist. So we will start now and then break for a drink in about an hour's time. And then hopefully one of the kind of solid intentions of this is that people will be able to make their own contributions afterwards. Okay, I'd like to welcome Chrissie.
MoMA Oxford, actually, just to correct you. Sometimes I wish we were in London, just so you could all get up to Oxford a bit more, but anyway. I'm going to start with a quote by Dan Graham, and then this paper's going to be very short, and it's really just to give some pointers towards understanding his early video work. Actuality is when the lighthouse is dark between flashes. It is the instant between the ticks of the watch. It is a void interval slipping forever through time, the rupture between past and future. It is the void between events. I want to set out in this short paper 3 pointers towards an understanding of Dan Graham's use of repetition and time delay in his early video installations and performances. Firstly, the 19th century experiments in depicting time photographically by Etienne Jules Marais and Edward Muybridge. Secondly, the development of Graham's video feedback pieces, their use of the mirror specifically, and their precursors in his early slide tape performance pieces. And thirdly, the environment of the 60s and early 70s within which he was developing his work, and a comparison of his early video installations with video feedback installations by other artists working during the same period. So to take the first point, during the 19th century, as I'm sure you all know, the experience of time underwent a profound transformation. The authority of a universal, uniform time was becoming more apparent with the increasing use of watches and clocks, and British Standard Time was established. A public time was being fixed for the first time. And at the same time, there was an increasing awareness of the subjectivity of private time, which was intensified by the development of the telephone and other technological developments. And this led to an expanded present, if you like, full of multiple events experienced simultaneously. This also obviously links to scientific developments happening at the same time. The contradiction between and coexistence of this fixed public time and the increasingly relative, subjective, personal, if you like, private time was precisely what Dan Graham's video feedback pieces, as well as his early performance demonstrations, sought to convey 70 years later, i.e. the impossibility of the modernist tenet of the perpetual present. The French pioneer in time and motion studies, Etienne Jules Marais, working at the same time as Edward Muybridge and sometimes in direct friendly competition, created a series of photographic instruments with which to record the passage of movement through space by placing multiple images on a single plate, as opposed to Muybridge's sequential serial studies. you may know that Mare was also, his experiments with this equipment led directly to the development of the cinema, of film as we know it. But that's not what Dan Graham's interest, who is very interested in both Mare and Muybridge, that's not where Dan Graham's interest in Mare lay, as I'll just mention again later. At the turn of the century, when Mare was working, the concept of simultaneity was coherent and popular. Mare's photographs exemplified this new perception of time. His overlapping forms appeared simultaneously, sometimes recording the body from the front, the side, and the rear, which had hitherto been impossible. He also built a special camera with an oscillating mirror, which separated movement into phases by reflecting the image onto a different part of the plate each time it moved. Mare's work, of course, influenced Marcel Duchamp, most obviously in his painting Nude Descending a Staircase, 1915, but I would also like to suggest a connection between Mare, Dan Graham's use of glass and mirrors, and Duchamp's large glass, which combined Duchamp's study of non-Euclidean geometry, something which greatly interested both Dan Graham and Robert Smithson, his great friend, as well as Mel Bochner, Sol LeWitt, Don Judd, and many others, and mathematics, with his interest, Duchamp's, in the fourth dimension. I think I've got the date of the Nude Descending a Staircase wrong there, sorry, I think it's 1912. In 1970, Dan Graham wrote an essay titled Photographs of Motion, analyzing Mare and Muybridge's experiments with depicting several points of view, which obliged the viewer's eye to engage in shifting movements. As Graham puts it, the denial of the Renaissance linear vanishing point inside the image in their work corresponded directly to the experiments he was later to make with the juxtaposition of the video feedback image and mirrors. It also connects to Alexandra Zevi's observation about George Kubler's book, The Shape of Time, which appeared in the 60s, and introduced the concept of seriality in relation to formal structures, bringing art close to the physical sciences. It's also obviously very related to the minimalists, as Mare and Muybridge's photographic experiments had done 70 years earlier. If I could have the first slide, please. It's nice that I started this thing of Mare and then discovered Dan's essay on Mare later, which is always nice. This, kindly lent by Michael Newman, is Public Space, Two Audiences, from 1976, which he constructed at the Venice Biennale as one of several rooms that artists were invited to make during the Biennale. And it's two rooms, both of which are entered separately. You can see a door on the far left at the end of the wall, and then there's a door out of site over here. And this, I think, is very much a precursor of not a precursor, sorry, but has a strong relationship to the idea of video feedback. And the precursor to it, I think, is really, amongst other things, one of his two related projects for slide projector, which were devised in 1966 but never realized. I think it's quite interesting that also Homes for America, which are usually seen as related very much to the magazine format, was originally conceived as a slide tape piece. So in the two related projects for slide projector devised in 1966, in one of them, he reveals the construction of a multi-layered time and space, which became the core of his later video feedback pieces. In this piece, it was attempted by building up layer after layer of photographs, slides, of a large glass box with a mirrored floor. Photographs of this space were taken from different angles and distances, and then a smaller box was then built into, or would have been built into, the larger one, and then the whole thing rephotographed, and then a smaller box built into that, and then photographed again, till you had 80 slides, creating, as he described it, a mirroring perspective within a perspective, adding boxes within boxes. The resulting images would have been of a transparent illusionistic mirror space, developed in cyclical movements, because the camera, as it took the photographs, went around the space. So here we see early evidence of the circuit, the infinite cycle, the entropic perpetual present, which the video feedback image was later to both create and undermine. this piece you can see here is, as I say, these two rooms, and it has this very odd reflective glass whereby you can see your reflection, but you can also see the other people on the other side. Graham's earliest performance pieces using film seem to predict the use of the video feedback mechanism by placing two people opposite each other, both holding cameras, reflecting each other's movements in a reciprocal feedback. The two parties are each other's subject or observer, and the audience's attention is part of the circuit. These early film performances, Two Correlated Relations from 1969, Roll of 1970, and Body Press from 1970 to 1972, using Super 8 film cameras, all demonstrate the immanence of the self in the perceptual process, and the role of the self in the creating of the future behavior of both the self and the other about to be recorded. In Body Press, the mirror appears for the first time, in a closed cylindrical shape which echoes the shape of the interior space in the Dia roof piece, which invites the audience to become performers and make their own experiments in visual perception, as people always tend to do when they're up there on that roof in that middle part, however briefly. In Body Press, two performers, naked, hold a film camera pressed to their body and rotate it to film the body's surface. What they're actually filming is the reflection of the body in the mirror. So the camera is moved all around the body like this. And then when it gets to the rear, the cameras are exchanged, so each person passes their camera to the other. And so it becomes impossible in the later projection of both films onto opposite walls, which is what you see when you see the piece later, to determine which body belongs to which gaze. The normal, static perspective of the mirror image has been disrupted by the camera's intervention between subject and mirror, and the fact that its angle of recording the mirror image depends on where the camera is placed on the body. The disorientating effect of the mirror was already was used by many artists in the 60s, from Graham to Smithson, Robert Morris, and others, but it connects back further historically. Can I have the next slide, please? This is Dan Graham, some past continuous present from 1972. Consider, for example, when observing Dan Graham's Dear rooftop piece and its relationship to his use of repetition and multi-layered time and space, his great friend Robert Smithson's observations in his text Infinity and the Waning of Space in relation to the surrounding architecture of Manhattan. Writing about the interiors of many of these 30s buildings, Smithson declared, "The interior mirrors in those rooms multiply and divide reality into perplexing, impenetrable, uninhabitable regions. The mirror is a vain trap, an abyss." The anxiety with which Smithson described the oppressive sense of infinity and false presentness of the 30s mirrored interior spaces was shared by the architect, writer, and poet Paul Shibart, who said that mirrors have a disturbing effect on architecture. From the moment that they are introduced, there is no stability. The mercurial mirror is best avoided. It is like a dangerous poison. But it was this very instability which Graham sought. For him, the image in the mirror is perceived as a static instant. So place, time and space, becomes illusory and eternal. This is the kind of space that those early slide tape pieces were trying to create. The world seen on video, by contrast, this is still Dan Graham talking, is a temporal flux and connected subjectively to experienced duration. And what you see here is a room with two walls mirrored and a monitor set into the wall which records the viewer's behavior with an 8-second delay, and it's also reflected in the mirror because the camera is opposite one of the mirrored walls. Graham's interest in the time mechanism of being recorded, then played back, meant that when the video portaback camera, which allowed simultaneous recording and playback, arrived, it immediately became a central element in his performance and installation pieces. Its initial use by psychologists and sociologists only underlined the roots of his structure in these pieces. The combining of the video camera and monitor and mirror provided the perfect illustration of the dichotomy between temporal and spatial stasis and dynamism which so preoccupied Graham. The difference between a video and a mirror, as he observed, is that a mirror responds to the observer's movements but is meant to be read frontally, whilst the observer's image on a monitor depends on their relation to the camera behind or in front. The effects of juxtaposing the two can be seen very clearly in this piece. The images reflected in the mirror are replayed and relayed, as I was saying, with a time delay of 8 seconds, but because of the reflection, there's a further time delay of another 8 seconds, so effectively 16 seconds. And this dichotomy between recorded and present time gives you, as Diane Graham suggests, a sort of extended presentness, if you like. Whatever you do returns to you, and you become hyper-aware of your own activity because it becomes part of the cycle. So this circuit is set up, this feedback circuit, and this is something very pertinent to experiments that were taking place in the 60s with biofeedback, with cybernetics, and all kinds of experiments in psychology to do with the viewer or the subject becoming part of the process of self-perception. With video feedback, the viewer can see their image played back almost immediately, which, as Diane Graham says, connects our self-image of our behavior to our inner mental consciousness. And Dan Graham has pointed out many times that his work in these areas is very connected to all that experimentation that was going on in the 60s, counterculture, which took in a very broad range of different attempts to create a different kind of social self, from feminism to meditation to also drug culture. So your actions become part of the process, and so there's this sort of circuit that's being set up. Graham's pervasive use of the mirror and reflected glass with video time delay to create coexistent representations of time and space is also connected more broadly to other conceptual art practices of the 60s and 70s, including Robert Smithson's writings on entropy in the mirror, Ad Reinhardt's depiction of different representations of time in his paintings, and the preoccupation with presentness of the minimalists. It can also be connected to Deleuze's discussion of the use of the mirror in film to create what he calls crystalline circuits of time, a concept which Smithson would have understood. It could even be argued to have influenced, much later on, Gary Hill's Tall Ships. And there is certainly a link across the perceptual video spaces of Peter Campers, as I'll show in a moment. The utopian sociological and psychological experiments and ideas which Graham was using were adopted by a large number of artists during this time, including Peter Campus, Vito Conci, Paul Ryan, Bruce Nauman, David Hall, Stuart Brisley, and others. Feedback was part of this do-it-yourself, as Graham puts it, psychological models which were being tried out by artists all over the place. This field which is created in which audience and performers place reciprocal controls on each other. Could I have the next slide, please? This is a video piece by Peter Campus called Interface from 1972. And this is actually the artist himself demonstrating it. In the middle of the room, a camera records the audience's image onto this glass screen. You can see the camera in front of the artist, and another camera behind projects another image of the viewer in a sort of mirror image. So you get this very strange sensation, which is quite similar to the sensation you get when you look at your reflection in one of Dan Graham's reflective glass structures, because you see yourself in this glass, but you see not only your mirrored self, which is what you're used to seeing in a mirror, but you see yourself the right way round, as it were, as others see you. Now, the difference between this piece and Dan Graham's work is that Peter Campus doesn't use time delay here. It's direct, so as you move, your image moves. But what he does place side by side, which is extremely disorientating, is a double image of yourself in these two different states. And this relationship as well to Gary Hill's tall ships, I think, is an interesting one, although it needs to be further explored, I think, because it's quite a complex series of issues there. But if I could have the next slide. Bruce Naumann's live taped corridor of 1969. The previous piece we saw was 1972, which is exactly when Dan Graham was making some of those video feedback pieces. This is an earlier piece, and it has two monitors, one on top of the other, one of which shows your body walking towards the monitor. As you're walking in this very narrow space, it's only about 3 feet wide. It's several meters long. You gradually become aware that one of the images on the screen is you walking in real time up to the monitors, and the other image on the top screen is you with a time delay approaching it as you were filmed several seconds earlier. And of course, the nearer you get to the end of this corridor, the more of a discrepancy there is between the two images. So you see real time and previously recorded time delay simultaneously. Of course, these pieces are almost impossible to reproduce now without spending a great deal of money, because all these pieces were produced using reel-to-reel tape recorders, which were looped almost like audio tape, well, exactly like audio tape, from one machine to the other, which is impossible now, so it has to be done digitally. I mean, it's a small point, but I think it's an important one, because the equipment actually does rather dictate the way in which ideas are realized, just as those film pieces of Dan Graham's were only realizable because the Super 8 cameras had a fixed focus, because otherwise every time you moved the image would go out of focus. If I could have the next slide, please. I just included this to show you, this is Les Levine, Iris, made in 1968. This is a rather more pop, this is on the pop end of artists working with video. This is an object, it's a sort of plexiglass and fluorescent light construction, which is seen as a sculpture. It's quite difficult to tell because the slide is very bad, but it's set into a space like a sculpture, and it has 6 different time delays on each screen, and each screen is covered with a different plexiglass of different colors. And so you see yourself and other people walking past at different points. If you go backwards and forwards, it's much easier to tell exactly which stage you're at in the process. But it's an interesting connection, I think, between the rather more purist conceptual works of artists working with video feedback and this more pop element. It's also one of the first pieces created like this using video time delay. Could I have the next slide, please? This piece, made slightly later by David Hall, British video artist, is called Progressive Recession, 1974. And this was shown in the Serpentine Gallery. You can see it here. And again, you've got this idea of the corridor. This is a corridor of sorts built into the gallery, and you start at this end, right as you see the front of the picture. And at this end and the opposite end, you've got a monitors facing each other, and then a row of monitors on the right, all with cameras above them. And each camera is on a time delay. And so what you see in the monitor that you're looking at is the image of yourself recorded from the previous monitor. So the first image you see doesn't have anything on it, and then the second image you see has an image of you as you were looking at the first one, and so on. And the progressive recession, as it were, as you go up the corridor, is traced as you step from one monitor to the next. And so your sense of time is disrupted. I think this is very interesting in relation to Dan Graham's pieces, actually. And in fact, I'm preparing a historical exhibition, major survey show of the history of video and film installation, in which I'm going to include both this piece and one of Dan Graham's early video pieces. So it'd be very interesting to, you'll be able to experience the different pieces perceptually, see what the differences are. This, if you could have the next slide, please. This piece by David Hall called Vidicon Inscriptions from the following year, 1975, also a very little known piece, is also a very interesting piece in relation to this idea of video feedback. And again, you can't see from this rather appalling slide, but it's also in a corridor construction. And what happens is you walk up a long corridor, and this monitor on a plinth is right at the end, rather like the Bruce Nauman piece. But as you come about 2/3 of the way into the corridor, you break a circuit, and a very bright light flashes and effectively takes your photograph on the screen, which is what you can see there. It burns your image onto the Vidicon, the Vidicon tube of the video. And this image of yourself remains for about half an hour. And when you come up to the screen fully, what you see is not only images of yourself, but images of other people who've gone just before you, which you can see about 3 people there, who have been burnt in and they're in the process of fading. And I think that piece is also very interesting in relation to certainly the slide from those of you who were at the talks at Camden last week that I think John Hilliard showed, of the difference in the different planes, so it's like a prism, the different planes where you can see your reflection in Dan's architectural pieces, and the layering, almost like Mary actually. It takes me right back to Mary. I wish I had a slide of that, where you have different recordings of movement on the same plane. So in this very brief paper, extremely brief, I've just tried to set out a few pointers, as I said before, that would just perhaps take Dan Graham's early video work out into a broader context within artists working with video installation and video feedback in the 60s and early 70s. And I'll hand you on to Judith now. Thanks. I'm an artist, not a theoretician, or an art historian, or an art critic, so my presentation would be personal, anecdotal, and visual, not necessarily in that order. A couple of weeks ago, when Dan was here, I asked him what he would have been if he hadn't been an artist. A writer, he replied. And then added that the reason he wasn't a writer was because it was too repetitive an occupation. I mention this more because of the title of the topic of the seminar, and also perhaps because some would say that all an artist ever does is constantly repeat themselves. But in Dan Graham's work, for me anyway, repetition is present in every part of the work, whether in the reflected image of the viewer in the mirror, or in the use of video to repeat an image in time and space. Graham is not really interested in the purely visual aspect of the medium of video that other artists tend to emphasize, or in the narrative that dominates television by either the ordering of the sequences or the vocal commentary. And there's a quote here that I'd like to read from Dan Graham, where he says, "Unlike film, where both sound and visual tracks are of necessity in the past and constructed from continuous segments, edited and recorded according to conventional rules of syntax, video, both visual and audio tracks, is assumed to correspond, be congruent to the real present time and space continuum, or the identical continuum from an earlier time, shared by both the products and receivers of the video.
In video, unlike film, the sound and visual tracks are presumed to be different perceptual aspects of this space's physical presence. And for this one, I don't know if I've got a slide of this actually. I wanted to illustrate, I'm rather low on slides, so my powers of description are sort of necessary here. I wanted to illustrate that quote by a work which is called Yesterday Today, which is from 1975, in which the visual image and the audio recording are 24 hours separate, separated by 24 hours. So it's a one-day time delay. And it reveals the difference between the oral and visual representation, and also the difference between the real space and the representation of that space. The work, you can't see it, it was sort of, he did various versions of Yesterday Today, and basically a video monitor is in sort of one space, in a public space, displaying a present time view of the visual activities of a second nearby room. This space is one having a characteristic presence in which the inhabitants' daily activities follow a defined routine with rhythmic periodicity. I'm quoting this because he writes it so well anyway. Related to a specific time of the day where people discuss ongoing activities informing an ongoing chronicle, and which imposes a definite modification in role of or of consciousness upon someone entering it. So the work is both representational and narrative, relating to the real historical sort of events of a particular space and the narrative contained within that space, whether it's in an institution or an art gallery. And he did this installation in both. Like at one point I think he had a monitor in a bar, another time he had it in a sort of nearby room, and another time he had it in a space across the road or something. So there were all these different variations of that work. And it also shows, obviously, because you see yourself, like if you're sort of, there's a camera recording this space, so it shows you the position of the viewer and subject relative to the time and space. And here I want to come on to, and that sort of, for me, is one of the main points of my interest in Dan's work, which is like sort of where one is, either as the viewer or the artist in relation to the work. And for this, I want to go back to actually my first slide, please. Thank you. This work is, I think the title is the 31st of the 4th, 1966, which is the artist's birthday. And it shows, as you know, I mean, John Hilliard showed this last week, and I think it's a great work. And it shows his position in relation to the universe, and in that rather childlike way that we all have of kind of trying to kind of, sort of say where we are. There's, I think, again, John mentioned this last week, sort of that there's that thing of like when you're a child, you sort of give your address as being sort of at the end of the road, or sort of the world, where you sort of go, say Bristol, then it's like the world, then it's the all those things. I'm not saying this very well, but this is an example, and it locates the artist in space and time. It's in a fixed point, but in relative to a galaxy or the street corner. And anyone who knows Dan will know that he has an interest in astrology. And when I asked him where that came from, he said astronomy. And at the age of 13, he built himself a telescope from a kit which was called Skyscope. And this is all him remembering these things, with which he could view the moons of Jupiter and the true red planets of Mars and Jupiter. So when other kids were going to the movies, he claimed he was looking through his telescope. And that this also relates to sort of the fact that his father was a research chemist who spent his time looking through a microscope. And he also added that this was probably part of his working out of the Oedipal complex. So yes, and you know. So yeah, this work is, the title of this work is his birthday, which is also, he shares his birthday with Bach and Haydn, and Bach is the greatest living greatest greatest composer ever, and I agree with Dan. And it also, this work comes from a series called Schema, which you'll find in Rock My Religion a few of, but I believe it's a separate publication, in which he refers to Raymond Lull and his theological systemization of knowledge, a system which Lull believed he could apply to anything. And I find that sort of relevant to this piece. Now I'd like to go to my second slide. No, what's my second slide? No, sorry, go back to the first one. I don't have a slide of this one, so you have to rely on my powers of description again. The work that I want to talk about here, the next work, is a piece called TV Camera Monitor Performance, and that's from 1970. And in this work, the artist actually performs, Dan Graham performed with the camera, and he's sort of prone. He's lying on the stage. You can't see this, so I'll have to describe it to you. There's a stage at the viewer's eye level, and the artist, you have to be the audience, and I'm the artist in this case, and the artist is lying with his feet towards you, holding a camera, and there's a monitor at the back of the audience. And so what he's doing is rolling backwards and forwards, but trying to keep the camera in the sight of the monitor. So he's setting up a feedback system. And again, for me, it's very much to do with sort of the position of the artist in relation to, well, both the viewer and the object, the subject, like where he is in relation to the work. And shall I get my notes back? So he's creating this feedback system, and he's creating it sort of literally as well, because when you point a camera quite at a monitor, you actually get a spiral, which some of you may be familiar with, which I'll come back to in a minute. But he describes the image on the monitor as being a subjective view from inside his mind's eye, which I thought was very interesting. And this view is continuously rotating. It's not stable. And he refers to the whole his whole position as being my body's feedback system. And the audience can observe the monitor by looking at the rear to see the view from the artist's subjective view. Again, that's my body's feedback system in his view. But the audience looking to the front sees the artist's body from an external vantage as an outside object. The monitor's view also shows the audience placed directly between the camera and the monitor, observing the performer's process of orientation. A spectator that turns to the rear to look at the monitor can never see their own gaze directly, but sees the back of his or her own head, and they can observe the other members of the audience gaze. And the thing about the feedback, I just wanted to say that the thing about the spiral image of the feedback, which I see as a kind of, perhaps also a kind of, and I think Chrissie mentioned this in her talk, almost a reference to the psychedelic and perhaps drug-induced visual experience. And at this point, I'd just like to put a bit of tape on, the first bit of videotape, which is rather tangential use of a bit of From Rock My Religion. Might have a bit more volume.
In 1890, the Plains Indians,
thanks.
having lost their land...
That was just really a link for me, you know, because I don't know how many people know either the tape or the book, but in Rock My Religion, he takes, you know, like, this is a very simplistic view of it, he links the religious dancing, the communal physical activity of the Shakers, originally Ann Lee's Shakers, to rock and roll. And this clip showed some people kind of indulging in that activity, which leads to a kind of trance-like state. And again, that sort of interests me in terms of like the body and the role of the body, and seems to be important in sort of like this idea of fragmentation and control, and like how we view the body, and how the artist views his own body, and the whole idea of the video feedback contradicting the mirror model of the perceived self. I'd like to go on now to another example of a work called Present Continuous Past, which you've just seen. So I think I've got a slide of this. Yes, you've just seen this slide, and I'm sure you saw it last week if you came to the talk, because it's in this slide it's a room with mirrors on all sides, and on one wall is set a monitor, and just above the monitor is a camera. The mirrors reflect present time. The video camera tapes what is immediately in front of it and the entire reflection of the opposite mirrored wall. The image from the camera appears 8 seconds later, as you've already heard, in the video monitor via a tape delay placed between the video recorder, which is recording, and a second video recorder, which is playing back. And a person viewing sees, and I quote from this because I think it's a good quote. I mean, but again, you sort of know this really. Both the image of himself 8 seconds ago and what was reflected on the mirror from the monitor 8 seconds ago of himself, which is 16 seconds in the past, as the camera view of 8 seconds prior was playing back on the monitor 8 seconds ago, and this was reflected on the mirror along with the then present reflection of the viewer. An infinite regressive time continuums within time continuums, always separated by 8-second intervals within time continuums, is created. And I think Graham is adding time and temporality to self-perception. He's connecting self-perception to psychological brain processes. And again, I know my previous speaker spoke about this. This separates self-perception from the viewing of a detached static image. The video feedback contradicts the mirror model of the perceived self. It splits the idea that we have of privacy, even in a public space, when we see ourselves kind of doing things that we kind of weren't that conscious of, weren't that aware of. And those gestures become kind of observed, and it alters our behavior. So while the mirror alienates the self, video encloses the self, and that's another quote from Graham, with its perception of its own functioning, giving a person the feeling of the perceptible control over his responses through the feedback mechanism. Now, so Greg going thing. Sorry, can I have the next slide? I think there's one more of this. Thanks. That's an example of the public in that space. The other one being of the artist. And they do look rather self-conscious. And can I have the next slide, please? This is present continuous past. No, that was present. 2 rooms reverse video delay. I think, is it? Yes. Yes, thank you. And in this work, you can see the camera, the 2 cameras, and the delay is reversed so that one audience sees the other audience, but in delay, sort of with the same 8 seconds being employed, so they're seeing each other in reverse. And sorry, I seem to have lost my running order here. The thing that sort of. Oh yes, I think I have this one on tape. Maybe no, I don't have this one on tape. But can I have the next tape, please? Oh no, this is. No, this is great. No, this will be good now. Thank you.
The other foot splayed at an oblique angle to the right foot. Finger of my right hand is in my belt loop. The other finger, this is the index finger. The other index finger is inside the pocket. Hands out a little more. Elbows quite akimbo. Because of the splaying of the one leg, I seem to be leaning a little bit in the direction of my right side. The other is the left side. And as I say that, I start bending a little bit. I tend to lose my balance on that word. Correct my balance. It's obvious my balance is on the right foot, on the audience's left side. Now I rock back a little bit, correct myself. Seem a little bit stiff in the torso. As I do that, there's a gesture toward the 2 akimbo arms, which corrects itself. And now gradually the balance goes on to both legs and then onto the leg on the left side as I move about to walk very, very slowly in sort of 1/4 speed, lifting up the leg as I turn my body, lifting up the leg onto the toe of the right foot, still not moving, but continuous in a very, very slow kind of posture, rotating the body as I do that on the axis of the torso, moving so that my head is now facing, head going up, and is facing the black wall at my left side, the audience's right side, and a little bit of a gesture as if I'm about to motion, but not with my hands, which are stationary, with my torso. And then there's a kind of swaying back and forth on my torso from right to left. And as I do that, I make a full pivot, bring one foot on the other foot that's balancing on its toe, up, stop, look down. My head has been down. My hands haven't changed. No, they have changed. They're more regularized, so they both have the same position. And my arms are still slightly akimbo. That leg being up slightly gives me a kind of attitude of dashing commuter somewhat, but not actually going anywhere. And now as I say that, the other foot comes together and I straighten out. The knee is straightening out. Bending very stiff on the knee, and with that word stiff, I now try to loosen up my shoulders, and they're a little bit more loose. Look down again on my feet. One foot is splayed a tiny, tiny bit. That's the foot on the right side. Further out and advance from the other foot. It's funny how I moved without really walking at all. And as I balance back, I always tip over backwards and try to straighten out. And now I loosen up and I actually shake my feet and I'm actually walking to that right side of the stage, which is on the audience. And on the left side of the stage, right. And now it turns, so I'm walking right into the corner and raise my voice and I walk right into the corner now. It's funny that the finger, as I look down, verify that. The finger in my right hand is still in my pocket. And now I turn around again, looking at the audience, advancing very much toward the audience, and stopping and sliding in a kind of invisible line from one side of the stage to the other. Back, my head goes up as if I'm talking to the ceiling, and you can see my neck, you can see my green shirt, perhaps, and the matching tan pants. Rather nice autumn color code going with the other. I was going with the boots, and as I walk back, I have to constantly walk back to maintain my balance and balance on my heels, maybe a little bit macho kind of pose, showing that I can do it. Now my feet go for it in a much more relaxed kind of pose, sliding for it. The floor being slippery, they tend to keep sliding. My hands haven't changed until I said that. And now, coming from the loop on my belt, that finger, the right index finger, goes into the lock, the other two are very symmetrical. My ears perk up listening to something like a truck maybe outside. Now I look up again, looking at the light, and then down in the center, someone with the camera. Back down again. Very symmetrical, but a very odd position. It's as if I'm in a kind of yogi balancing position, but it's ridiculous because my feet are sliding apart as I talk about this. And now I straighten up and looking very good, and my shoulders go back again. And walking back, marching slightly back, directly backwards now. Much more of a march step, but very slow. This is maybe about half time. I stop, probably right in front of the mirror. Now the hands go out of the pockets. I look at my fingers. Seeming the left hand is over the right hand. They're very model looking, red and white model kind of colors. And the gesture is like, it's funny, it's both looking and maybe it's an appeal to someone, half religious, maybe it's not religious, very hard to tell. As I go up, well, my head goes up and now my hands very symmetrically are rubbing my eyes as if I'm waking up in the morning, but in a very religious kind of frame of mind, trying to keep it very symmetrical, center balance. Now the hands go down and they wipe themselves very symmetrically. And just as I say the word symmetrically, the knee on the right side goes up, jerkily, as if to emphasize maybe a lack of symmetry, and it goes down again, and sort of pacing slightly in place. Now I'm rubbing more with my left hand on the right side of the audience than I am with the right.
It's hard to know when to stop with that one, really. To finish, because I could go on, but I don't want to repeat myself. And I'd like to read a quote from Dan about the mirror image and video image. It's quite a long one, but a mirror's image optically responds to a human observer's movements, varying as a function of his position. As the observer approaches, the mirror opens up a wider and deeper view of the room environment and magnifies the image of the perceiver. By contrast, a video image on a monitor does not shift in perspective with a viewer's shift in position. The mirror's image connects subjectively with the perceiver's time-space axis. Optically, mirrors are designed to be seen frontally. A video monitor's projected image of a spectator observing it depends on that spectator's relation to the position of the camera, but not on his relation to the monitor. A view of the perceiver can be transmitted from the camera instantaneously or time-delayed over a distance to a monitor which may be near or far from the perceiver's viewing position in space or time. Unlike the flat visuality of Renaissance painting, in the video image, geometrical surfaces are lost to ambiguously modeled contours and to a translucent depth. Mirrors in enclosures exteriorize all objects within the interior space, so that they appear on the mirror as frontal surface planes. In rectilineal enclosures, mirrors create illusory perspective boxes. The symmetry of mirrors tends to conceal or cancel the passage of time, so that the overall architectural form appears to transcend time, while the interior area of the architecture, inhabited by human movements, process, and gradual change, is emptied of significance. As the image of the mirror is perceived as a static instant, place, time, and space becomes illusory eternal. The world seen on video, by contrast, is in temporal flux and connected subjectively, because it can be identified with, to experienced duration. Thank you.
Watching those tapes, it struck me that American conceptual art was invented by nerd geniuses, two of them, Dan Graham and Robert Smithson, among others. And then the thought crossed my mind, well, since Dan Graham is probably the most influential artist of his generation on young artists today, we're probably in for a revival of the nerd genius. That would be a repetition. And one of the things I want to discuss is quite what would be involved not only in that repetition, but in repetition in general. I want to consider Dan Graham's work in terms of two senses of repetition. And I'll just say that rereading this paper, I realized I was overcome by a kind of fit of dogmatism. So please forgive me if it sounds a little bit kind of hard line. But I'm not quite sure why that happened. But anyway. The first sense is that of the repetition of the avant-garde. The second sense of repetition emerges in relation to subjectivity and the question of self-presence. I will then attempt to bring the two senses of repetition together in order to suggest the necessity for a reinterpretation of conceptual art. I will approach the idea of a repetition of the avant-garde through Peter Burger's book, Theory of the Avant-Garde, which I'm sure a lot of you know, and was published in German in 1974 and English in 1984. To write, as Burger does, of the historic avant-garde, of the avant-garde as historical, is to describe it from the horizon of its failure. And it is only in terms of this that the special character of the avant-garde becomes visible. Burger makes a crucial distinction between modernism and avant-garde as two moments that Clement Greenberg, as we can see from the title of his essay Avant-Garde and Kitsch, conflates. Briefly, modernism is the culmination of what Burger calls aestheticism, which is the art historical moment when the autonomy of art becomes the content of the work of art. Once form becomes content, the autonomy of the work, in what Burger describes as its separation from the praxis of life, becomes apparent. This status, separation from the praxis of life, I quote, had always constituted the institutional status of art in bourgeois society, end of quote, and it now becomes apparent, and it now becomes the content of works, such that, and as Burger says, institutional frame and content coincide. This amounts, according to Burger, to a moment of self-consciousness of art that leads the avant-garde to a self-critique of art. If art is to be reconnected to the praxis of life, it is not the content that needs to be changed, but since with aestheticism the meaning of the individual work is referred to the autonomy of the institution of art that needs to be abolished. Two moments of practice may be introduced at this point. The first would be the development of Russian constructivism and productivism from the revolution to the early 1920s. Tatlin, Rodchenko and others sought to bring to an end the role of art to produce beautiful objects to be contemplated with pleasure and to find new tasks for artists in the creation of a new society. In principle, this meant seeking an entirely new kind of work, a new techne, but in practice, artists had to fall back on existing models or social roles. The architect-engineer in the case of Tatlin's Monument to the Third International, the designer in the case of clothing and magazines designed by Rodchenko and Stepanova, and the scientist in the attempt to transform the artist's studio into a kind of laboratory where forms could be investigated. The possibility of continuing to be an artist while connecting art with the praxis of life outside the institution of art would depend on a transformation of society that would make a beautiful life for all possible, a transformation that did not happen. The second practice is that of the Duchampian ready-made. I don't obviously have to go into this, you're all familiar with it. Now, Duchamp himself anticipated that the consequence of the avant-garde would not be the dissolution, but the reinforcement of the institution of art. Thus, when a successor to Duchamp submits a ready-made, it is because he wants to get his work, or she wants to get her work, into the museum, rather than to destroy it. This is the moment of what Burger calls the neo-avant-garde, the effect of which, amounts to an inversion of the aim of the avant-garde, precisely an extension and strengthening of art as institution, no longer dependent on a relation to any particular kind of object, or indeed any object at all. Dan Graham's generation, emerging in the late 1960s, at the time of the student movements, is the one to follow this neo-avant-garde. The problem for this generation was precisely that of how to repeat the avant-garde without repeating it. In other words, how to repeat the avant-garde without falling into the trap of the neo-avant-garde, reinforcing precisely an institution that deprives art of its use value. The solution was to be twofold. On the one hand, to repeat the decommodifying, defetishizing turn to use value in, for example, the use of the magazine page. Graham's project Homes for America, as it was published in the magazine, could be related back, for example, to Leff. And in functional projects outside the gallery, or in a détournement of the gallery and the museum, as in the case of work by both Dan Graham and Michael Asher. On the other hand, to incorporate repetition into the work itself by subjectifying minimalist repetition. It is with the question of how these two types of repetition, that is both the repetition of the decommodifying move, the turn to use value, and the incorporation of the serial repetition already to be found in minimalist art into a kind of subjectifying move. It's the question of how these two types of repetition might relate to each other that I now turn to a consideration of the work of Dan Graham. Paradoxically, and this is one of the things that makes it interesting, Dan Graham's practice is both governed by and seeks to undermine the fantasy of self-presence. For Michael Fried, pure presentness was a necessary condition of the modernist work of art, and I quote Fried, "It is this continuous and entire presentness, amounting to the perpetual creation of itself, that one experiences as a kind of instantaneousness, as though if only one were infinitely more acute, a single infinitely brief instant would be long enough to see everything, to experience the work in all its depth and fullness, to be forever convinced by it. I want to claim that it is by virtue of their presentness and instantaneousness that modernist painting and sculpture defeat theatre." End of quote. It is not hard to hear the anxiety in this statement. Theatre, the sense of duration that is irreducible in the experience of the minimalist art Fried is attacking, is not secondary but primary, and it is the task of modernist art to defeat it, or at least to exclude it. What is at stake here is a kind of difference or otherness in self-consciousness, a grit that motivates the desire for self-presence's closure, while at the same time making it impossible. What is at stake is the difference between self-presence, which is what Fried wants, and self-consciousness, which is what Dan Graham's work brings about. Whereas Fried stands at the culmination and perhaps the end point of a tradition, conventionally taken to start with Descartes, that equates self-consciousness with self-presence, Graham in his work, and this is most clear in the early video installations and performances of the early 1970s, breaks self-consciousness and self-presence apart. The effect is to demonstrate that self-consciousness involves non-self-presence. Most obviously, and this could be taken as an extrapolation from Fried's 1967 article, it does so in terms of finite temporality. Graham contrasts the instantaneousness of the mirror reflection, which he sees as equivalent in its positioning of the spectator to traditional perspective painting, with a duration introduced by video. In that respect, a monitor facing a viewer who is filmed from above the monitor is quite different from a mirror reflection of that same viewer, a difference Graham brings out by introducing a time delay into the playback. In present continuous pasts, as we've already heard, by the use of an 8-second delay combined with a mirror opposite the monitor, he multiplies that delay into an infinite temporal as well as spatial regress. Self-consciousness always fails to achieve self-presence insofar as temporality is its condition. But is temporality different enough? Recall that for Kant, time is the form of inner sense, and that for Husserl, what he calls absolute consciousness, that is consciousness outside of which there is nothing, is a form of auto-temporalization. And indeed, we find in Graham's early installations that time delay is directed towards feedback. I would suggest that what this implies is that rather than breaking the circuit, the introduction of time delay and temporalization actually enlarges it. This is what I mean by suggesting that the work remains governed by a fantasy of self-presence. However, opposed to this is a pull towards fragmentation and dissemination, which is equally powerful in the work. And this I would locate where an irreducible spatiality or spacing intervenes in temporalization. That point is repetition. I want to consider for a moment the relation between reflection and repetition. Involved in reflection, there is already an apparatus, minimally a reflecting surface, and the intervention of another, since the reflected image needs to be identified as the image of the model. That's you. So even at the level of reflection, self-presence is impossible, which becomes painfully obvious in Graham's performer-audience mirror. The video is on view at Camden, and a part of it was shown by Judith, where we see not only Graham's awkwardness, the externality of the body, but also a willing loss of control within what is at the same time quite a tightly orchestrated structure. These elements of externality and reflection amounting to a kind of exposure, a being exposed both temporally to unpredictable change and spatially to the outside. What is at stake in this exposure becomes apparent, I think, only through repetition. What we see, or perhaps better experience, in a number of the early installations is the becoming repetition of reflection. This is the case in all the time delay video mirror installations, where the real-time action is repeated in a feedback loop to be returned via a monitor to the space in which it was initially reflected, or into another space as well. Representation is shown to be based on repetition, which through the loop inserts itself into any subsequent original action. Self-representation is thus at once supported by and subverted by repetition. What this generates is a tension between progress, that is to say, learning through feedback, which appears to be the explicit intention here, and regression. The regression is from representation and its reciprocal reversal, use value in terms of the opening up of a space of communication, to sheer, unspeakable repetition. This emergence of sheer repetition is linked, I think, with the collapse of subject and object into each other through the use of reflection and two-way mirrors. Repetition emerges in the interstices of abysmal or catastrophic reversal. Another way of putting this is to say that when distance is subtracted from self-representation, what emerges is not the coincidence of the self with itself through identity, but repetition and difference, the irreducible externality of spacing, which is, of course, what ultimately makes self-presence impossible. In conclusion, I want to return to the topic of the repetition of the avant-garde in order to consider how the analysis of repetition in Graham's work might contribute to our understanding of conceptual art. There are simultaneously two forms of repetition of the avant-garde in Graham's work. What we might provisionally call an identical repetition and a differential repetition. His work attempts an identical repetition of the avant-garde in that first, it forces a cognitive self-consciousness of the institutional conditions of art, which is a repetition of the Duchampian moment, although in Graham's case, in, for example, Public Space Two Audiences of 1976 at the Venice Biennale, it is the audience themselves who are subject to the conditions of display in a conflation of exhibition space and shop window. And, second, it enacts a conversion of exhibition value to use value, which is most obvious in the designs for spaces for showing videos, which recall the Russian constructivist worker club reading room of 1925 by Rodchenko. Of course, this repetition cannot be identical, since the first avant-garde was not supposed to have been repeated. The very repetition of the avant-garde is a mark of its failure to transform the institution of art, and therefore, as a repetition, has a different meaning from that of the historic avant-garde. Indeed, the historical avant-garde becomes historic in its repetition. But if this is the negative aspect of repetition, there is also a positive side. The inscription of repetition inside the work releases what could be called a positive power of repetition. This occurs when the seriality of the minimal object, for example in the work of Donald Judd, which in minimalism ties the formal structure of the work to social forces of production, is reinvested by the implosion of subject and object that takes place in Graham's installations. Pushed to an extreme, the relations of representation are shown to depend on a power of repetition. The reciprocity of communication, the use value of the work, is shown to be grounded in a non-reciprocal power which has an asymmetrical relation with representation, in that it creates the necessity for representation without itself being representable. Another word for this power is drive. To generalize, this interpretation of Graham's work opens up the possibility for an approach to conceptual art which is different from the one in terms of cognition and use value, and which would be built on the feminist and psychoanalytic extension and critique of conceptual art, both in practice and in theoretical terms. We could develop this interpretation in the direction of the idea of traumatic repetition, repetition in relation to another in myself that is more than myself. And we could develop it also towards the idea of non-closure. It seems to me to be true of all manifestations of the avant-garde that they attempt to move from the work as the representation of an event to the work itself as event, or the event as the work unworking itself. Now, the becoming historical of the avant-garde coincides with the recognition of the impossibility of the pure event. The event is impossible without repetition, is always already marked by repetition. If the avant-garde sought to bring art to an end, that which emerges in the repetition of the end, the repetition of the avant-garde, that was the task of Dan Graham's generation of artists, that which emerges in this repetition is repetition itself. A repetition that makes ending or closure impossible.
Okay, well, could we sort of break now for about 10 minutes and allow people to go upstairs if they want to get a drink in the bar and meet back here in 10 minutes. Lovely. Thanks. Judith. 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 very well.
No, you can't sit in.
Do you want to come sit in the middle?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, look, there's a ticket.
Go boy, go boy.
Okay.
Can you pass me a glass, please? Thank you.
Let's start. Maybe it would be useful to start first of all with any questions that people wanted to put to any of the speakers, and then we'll open it out to kind of lengthier, but maybe there are points of clarification that people wanted to make. No? In which case, let's kind of invite other interventions. Well, you'll all stay here till we've done speaking.
I'm quite interested in the complexity that comes out of these things which are very simple. I mean, when you actually try and explain them or try and think them through, you don't get anywhere near what actually happens. I mean, I suppose from seeing the pieces at Camden, you kind of go in the opposite direction and you think, could you have known? Okay, yeah. From seeing the pieces at Camden, you sort of think, could you have known the kind of complexity that would come out of this without making them? And then tonight we sort of see it the other way in a way, because trying to describe things, a lot of them you just don't actually get near understanding what they are, and without actually experiencing them, it makes you very keen to actually experience them, I think.
Brian, do you want to be Oprah Winfrey?
Well,
carry it around.
actually, maybe this is slight. I can answer this. I mean, I had exactly the same feeling. It was my original aspiration for the exhibition that we might try to recreate some of the works from the 70s, which is itself a problem of repetition, actually. And you mentioned that, in fact, they're quite difficult to rebuild, aren't they, technically? It's a very strange sort of situation, that, to be so dependent upon a simple, apparently simple kind of technical glitch, that as if there was a kind of technical window that was opened and then closed again. I mean, one thinks of technology as always accumulating more and more, not closing down.
But technology has always, in terms of video installation, the history of video installation, technology, the development of new technology has always dictated the form, hasn't it? I mean, well, not just video, film too, like that fixed focus Super 8 camera, which without which Dan couldn't have made those. He couldn't have made Body Press and those other film pieces, because it relied on the fixed focus, so that when you moved around, you were still seeing the image, still able to see the image. And so that the distortions you were looking at were distortions to do with movement and space rather than focus, although you can't really separate those things. And it's the same with the video camera. I mean, nobody that I know really is making work to do with feedback or the video camera. Surveillance is the video camera is so prevalent now in society everywhere, from Sainsbury's to whatever. You can't, the artists aren't using it at all. It was a very specific time in video. Just as now, with the development of the video projector, everyone's making large-scale colour projected images on walls. And the monitors almost disappeared as a sculptural component, which it was in video installation in the 80s. And video installations in the 80s, you got a lot of black boxes because that's what Sony were making. And likewise, those cameras and the Portapak were really they dictated a number of pieces, didn't they, by artists who were working with feedback. Just as the Vidicon tube and the burning of the image on the Vidicon tube, Mary Lucier was doing it, David Hall, several other people, and that's not, you can't do that anymore because they've improved, in inverted commas, the technology.
I don't know whether it was you, Chrissie, was saying it earlier. Putting a statement about the technology being used by the artist. It seems to me it's always that way round, that a truly perceptive person will come along, see what there is in the way of technology and use it, rather than what I thought you were saying, which was that, I can't actually remember what you said, but it was putting it the other way round, saying that.
I don't think so. I suppose what I meant to say was that a perceptive person, an artist, will come and use what's available, but what's available changes, and therefore
Yes.
it will, that in itself
that's
will...
what I wonder, that's my next point, is how much do you think at this stage, after all these years, the manufacturers are responding to what the artists might do? I know they're certainly responding in computers, of course, to the way it's used by a variety of people. Do you think that video and film manufacturers have responded to what the artist is doing?
I think that, I mean, Judith can answer that probably much more clearly than I can. All I know, just to respond from my end, is that artists have tended to build their own versions of things and pull things apart, like Steve Farrar making that wonderful piece which is built out of 35mm cameras, where it's a projector and a camera at the same time, or Namjoon Paik working with engineers in the 60s to build synthesizers and special hybrid machines to make pieces. Exactly, but in terms of manufacturers, I don't know. Judith may know more than I do.
Well, I mean, no, I think that the manufacture of video machines and cameras is entirely down to kind of, well, in fact, what artists tend to use is the domestic market, and it's down to kind of market forces. So, I mean, you're talking about kind of people shifting units in first Japan, then America, then Europe. And
I just wondered if they had their eye on what artists were doing.
not really. Not in. I mean, you know, I think they do sponsor artists now and again, but I think the technology sort of is, you know, it's not really. No.
Well, I don't think that's actually necessarily the case, just from
Really?
my experience. I mean, there are computer software technology companies that employ artists as a kind of, to develop ideas that might not have been thought of before as ways of demonstrating their technology and extending it. So that is in fact happening.
I think that's a different pool, though. Yeah, no, well, I mean, I was replying to the video thing and film thing, and I think that is different to the kind of pool that of thinking that might be going into computing.
Also, I think it's the case that with slide tape, which Dan Graham was using very early on, and which artists actually used a lot in the late 60s, early 70s, and video cameras, was because that's what was available in teaching institutions. And a lot of Dan's early performances were done as, he calls them demonstrations. They were made with students. They weren't, you know, done like public performances with ticketed sales. It was experiments done with groups of students in art schools, in a teaching kind of situation, and I think that's important too.
But maybe there's a distinction to be drawn in any case, because clearly when a kind of technology develops, you know, whether or not artists are involved in its kind of specialized development and production, that seems like an issue of making the the technology kind of more responsive and sophisticated, and its outcome somehow more artful and fluent. But I think that's what's very striking about those early kind of video things, and I think it relates to your point that in some sense some of the issues haven't been kind of continued to be worked out, is that it constitutes a kind of heroic moment, because as it were the development of a certain technology, it suddenly hits someone with the force that this is an object to think with, and therefore it's immediately seized upon as a wonderful means of demonstrating something and asserting it. And then, of course, it perhaps loses that kind of initial wish to pursue a thought, and begins, as it were, to start the pursuit of a technique. And so one sees the gradual sort of bifurcation or kind of degradation of the sort of startlingly illustrative capacity. That at that point it was very kind of dramatic. It wasn't logically necessary. You would actually have been able to, even if it didn't exist, describe an imaginary technology that did this. But for it to be able to be realized in the early 70s, has this kind of force of the new. One of the problems is that even if you go on doing that, it loses the force of the in a sense, those techniques which are done in such a kind of awkward, heroic way, just become part of the fluent vocabulary of every bad piece of filmmaking and whatever. I mean, which in any case, is part of the thought about that.
One of the things which, should I swing this around? One of the things which intrigues me about looking at Dan Graham's early projects in relation to what Marcus said is a kind of ambiguity, and I suppose this in a way lay behind my paper, because on the one hand, the way they're described, these projects seek to use technology in an emancipatory way, to increase knowledge, to increase communication between people, to increase self-consciousness, etc. Yet the effect of the technology is at the same time catastrophic. I mean, in a sense, to go back to this first question, your question about experience, on the one hand, video feedback loops, etc., make possible new kinds of self-experience and extend self-experience. On the other hand, they destroy the very possibility of experience partly through the introduction of repetition. So it seems to me that the same technology is simultaneously, in the same work, kind of emancipatory and catastrophic. And it's that kind of catastrophic side that actually I find makes Dan Graham's work very interesting. Not simply a sort of didactic repetition of the avant-garde in terms of a turn to use value a la Benjamin Buchloh, but something sort of much more complex and disturbing.
Perhaps that's why Smithson and the other writer I mentioned earlier were talking in such sort of anxious terms about the effects of the mirror. I mean, it's described as, I know it's not the same as the video feedback, but the idea of it as a poison. This is very sort of emotive but a dangerous poison. But it does relate in a sense to what you're saying. And there's this sort of entropy that's created. This circuit is actually terribly static in the end.
But in a sense, that historically describes the relationship between any practice of self-consciousness on the one hand and kind of technology. I mean, in a sense, the ambivalence that you can find expressed in Plato about the introduction of writing, I mean, is in many ways exactly kind of what Michael has said. On the one hand, it's brought forward as a technology which will permit communication across distances which can't be carried by the voice. On the other hand, it's denounced as a mechanical supplement which will poison and kind of ruin the authenticity of self-presence. And so it seems to me, you know, this is partly the working out of an extremely kind of traditional problem that kind of art and philosophy has always had in respect to technology, and which in some sense kind of defines its essential kind of ambivalence as between what Michael you know, is characterizing as an advance and a catastrophe.
And in a sense, you know, I have a feeling in the trajectory of Dan's work that it has to do with a direction in which that sort of catastrophic side of technology will overcome itself somehow into a new form of presence. I mean, I think in the relation, say, in the notion of the relation between rock and religion, and this interest in, you know, ecstatic religious movements, and yet developed through a highly technologically mediated form of music, so that very technological kind of mediation of sound will actually allow the overcoming of the sort of destruction of experience that technology brings about. It'll be overcome technologically, so it's not a kind of regression to some notion of authenticity. It's almost trying to push through somehow that limit of technology.
I think it's quite interesting thinking about the technical or even logistical difficulties in producing the work, in the video work, that there's a question that I find a bit uneasy to deal with in relating the video work to the constructed, more recent work, relating to some stuff. There's a question as to what extent it is necessary to produce the actual thing itself, and to what extent it's important to experience the experiential, perceptual process, the work itself. Because there are a number of pieces, specifically in the gallery next door, where there is a question as to whether the real thing, if you can call it that, should ever be built. We have models of ideas, constructed ideas that pertain to what might be the reality. But there's debate as to whether it would ever actually be a reality. And there's a relationship that I can't quite feel comfortable with as to, you know, looking through the catalogue, video architecture and art, you see the diagrams of what the video pieces were. You read through the descriptions, and you sometimes wonder actually to what extent the piece is to be made as a thing, as a space, or to what extent it just exists as an idea. And I find it quite uneasy because I can't quite. There's a point at which you think, well, actually, the piece doesn't have to be made.